Y'all, if you are over the age of 35 and you are just now getting diagnosed with ADHD, then first of all, welcome to our amazing, rather quirky club. You are not alone with that one. And when you get this diagnosis, it can be a lot because there's a lot to process there. So in today's episode, I'm going to go through the top 5 things I think every woman over the age of 35 who's been just diagnosed with ADHD needs to know about in order to get a grip. Let's just say that, because I know what you're feeling like when you've just gotten this diagnosis because everything's falling apart and you just can't get your head straight and you feel like a hot mess express. I have been there, and I'm going to tell you the top 5 things that I wish somebody had told me about when I first got diagnosed. My neuropsychologist didn't tell me about this. It wasn't available in the books that I read. So N equals 1 example here, but I think what I'm going to share is helpful. And I have to say that this conversation is solely about the female experience getting diagnosed at midlife, mostly because our lived experience is a lot different from men, both hormonally, biologically, and culturally. So I can't speak to a man's midlife experience, so I'm speaking to you gals. If you're over 35, maybe you're 45, maybe you're 50, I think that's when a lot of us start getting diagnosed, then you might find this helpful. So let's say you are an adult and you just got diagnosed. There's probably 2 reasons why that's happened. Either you have just gotten your kiddos diagnosed and the person who diagnosed them said, maybe you should look at this too, or maybe you're perimenopausal or menopausal or at some stage in life where everything that you've done to cope with your brain your entire life is no longer working. And therefore, you feel like you're kind of falling apart. So you seek out a diagnosis because you think you might be losing your mind. And surprise, surprise, you're not. You just have a sparkly brain. That is how I got diagnosed. It was 2020 and I was kind of falling apart. I was anxious, I was depressed, but also I couldn't remember things. I couldn't focus on anything. I was struggling to keep my concentration during work meetings and even phone calls with friends. It was really hard for me to focus. I also had a running brain that was just constantly going and I couldn't make it stop. The struggle is real. So anyways, those were the things that were happening to me. And it was kind of terrifying. I really did think that I was losing my mind. And it wasn't until I heard a podcast that Chalene Johnson recorded where she was talking about her experience getting diagnosed with ADHD as an adult when it all just kind of became crystal clear, because she went through some of the reasons that made her seek a diagnosis, and everything she was explaining sounded exactly like me. I was like, whoa. That is me to a T. Oh my God, maybe I'm not losing my mind. Maybe my mind is just neurodivergent like hers. So I am forever grateful to her for sharing her experience, because that was the catalyst for me getting my own diagnosis, which has completely changed my life, like a 180 since getting the diagnosis. And now we're going to jump into the 5 things that I really want to stress to you as things to focus on when you first get the diagnosis for yourself, because there's a lot going on there and there's a lot to process and comprehend. So let's dive right in with number 1, and that is giving yourself time and space to digest and grieve the diagnosis. Because once you learn this about yourself, everything is going to have to be reevaluated through this lens. Every dumb mistake you've ever made, every relationship that fell apart, everything that you've forgotten or misunderstood, or emotions that you haven't been able to control, all of those things need to be digested through this new lens. So for me, that meant that I had to look back at every mistake that I've made in my life and realize that I wasn't a hot mess. I had to completely look back at my entire early education and realize that I wasn't dumb. I thought I was dumb because I couldn't tell time until I was 13. I still can't do fractions. Geometry, I don't even know what that is. And then things like grammar. I don't know what an adjective is, and I write for a living. all of these things that have made me believe that I was just not a good student, not very smart, not going to amount to much, had to be reevaluated with this new lens of no, it was just I was not being accommodated for the type of brain that I had, and I was trying to survive as best I could in a world that really wasn't designed for me. To be clear, I didn't grow up in a family that was very supportive in these areas to begin with. We were all doing the best that we could, and I appreciate that of my parents, but without this diagnosis or any understanding about neurodiversity in the 70s and 80s, I was pretty much just considered the one that wasn't going to achieve much in her life, and boy, did I prove them wrong. But that was the stigma I lived with for a long time. I'm coming up on the 1-year anniversary of my diagnosis, and I'm still going through a lot of life events and reframing them with this new awareness. If you have access to a therapist, that's going to make this process go a lot faster, I think. But even if you don't, just journaling, thinking about things, giving yourself time to grieve is so incredibly important. The next thing I would recommend that you do is find your community. One of the biggest gifts I have found in this neurodiverse universe that I've been uncovering is that ADHDers are the coolest people. We're interesting, we're kind, we're authentic, we're a little quirky, but we know how to have a good time. And we're just genuinely nice people with big hearts, which is why we often get connived and snookered a lot of the time. But man, once I got into a coaching program, both to be coached and also the professional coaching program that I joined to become a coach, I was introduced to this group of people that were so kind and so wonderful. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel quite so alone. I felt like there's other people out there that think the same way I do, that struggle with the same things I do, and that it's not that I'm broken, I'm just different. But here's all these people where I'm not different. I'm the same as them, and we all relate to each other. And that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So as soon as you can, I highly recommend that you find some people. Start going to local meetups, find Facebook groups, join a group coaching program, whatever is accessible to you and feels most comfortable to dip your toe in the water, so to speak. Just find it. Go out there and find it. Do not be afraid, because ADHDers are awesome and you will feel immediately at home and welcomed. Now, I will say that recommendation comes with a caveat, which is actually the third recommendation that I have for you once you're newly diagnosed, and that is to mind your influences. Now, there are a lot, as I mentioned, of ADHD groups out there, communities. There's also a lot of ADHD influencers. There's a lot of people on Twitter talking about it, and Instagram, and of course, TikTok. And that is all great. However, there is also a common thread within ADHD discussions about how it impacts us in a negative way. Very often we skew the conversation in the direction of frustrations and challenges, because there are aspects of ADHD that are really difficult, and I never want to sugarcoat that. However, there's also things about ADHD that are amazing, just like there's difficulties and amazing things in being a neurotypical. My point here is that we're all human beings, but when you have ADHD, you might have a tendency to blame every negative trait or poor behavior or decision on your ADHD. And the reality is, we're going to make poor decisions regardless of our brain style and our thinking style. So when you start finding these collective conversations where everybody's talking about how they're a mess, they're getting fired from their jobs, they're dealing with addictions and impulse control, emotional regulation, you might start listening to these conversations and thinking, oh my gosh, is this me too? Maybe I'm dysregulated. Maybe I'm too impulsive. And you might be adding layers to yourself that aren't necessarily there. Everybody presents ADHD differently. So it's really important to understand that your flavor of ADHD is going to be different from somebody else's. So we all have our own individual struggles, and some of them are just personality traits. The other thing that might happen is if you don't relate to a lot of the struggles that you're seeing within the community, you might start to question your diagnosis. Maybe I don't have ADHD. Maybe I am just a hot dumpster fire of a mess, and that's just who I am. And this ADHD thing is not really the deal for me. I've gone through that myself. So I think it's really important as you find these communities, understand what the underlying narrative is. Are they a bitch fest community, or are they people sharing resources and support and generally trying to find ways to solve common problems? Because finding a positive and supportive community can make all the difference. Finding communities that are somewhat unmoderated and they're not sharing helpful content might bring you down. And that's not helpful when you've first been diagnosed and you're just a sponge trying to learn everything. The next thing I recommend you doing is committing to finding your own way with everything. So you might find a therapist, you might find a coach, you might ask other people that are also neurodivergent how they do things or how they're managing themselves. And those things are great. It's great to hear other people's experiences, but psychological research is very clear that we are most motivated to follow through on our own ideas rather than the ideas of others. So if you're constantly deferring solutions from other people as opposed to listening to what's inside, then you can very easily get overwhelmed and start questioning yourself a lot. The sooner you can start to trust yourself and trust the decisions that you make, the sooner you're going to really understand what works for you and what doesn't. And when you understand that, then you can really start to build this life that's ADHD friendly, that works for you. And from that place, you can really thrive with a neurodivergent brain. There's a lot that you can do when you have the right support and when you've set up your life in a way that complements your specific needs. So if you want to get help figuring out what those are. Find a coach or a therapist that can help you discover who you are, what your strengths are, and how you can find support and boundaries to really accentuate the best parts of yourself and outsource those things that perhaps aren't in your zone of genius. And number 5 is to leverage your intuition. So I have been diving deep into research around ADHD and intuition. And what I've learned is that because we have divergent attention, we're often picking up things in the room that neurotypical people aren't picking up because they're so busy, focusing on what they need to focus on. So for example, if you're in a loud, busy restaurant where the tables are close together, I bet you have a hard time conversing with the person you're having dinner with. You might be hearing everybody's conversation and dishes clacking and people walking around and, just that general hum of a restaurant. And it can be very distracting because you're picking up everything in your periphery, right? So it makes it very difficult to focus on the person in front of you. However, that is also our spidey sense finding things in the atmosphere. And if there is someone with a high amount of drama or a very strong energy, chances are you are going to pick that up. And if you can learn to really hone that skill, it can be incredibly powerful. And I'll give you a couple of examples from my own life where I've started to realize that I do have a very strong sense of intuition. Like one example is the conference I went to last month. I knew I got this little nudge that I shouldn't go. Even though it was fully paid and everything else, I kind of felt like this might not be the right thing for me. And I tried to cancel my flight or get a refund on the hotel. And of course that didn't work out. So I thought, screw it, I'm just going to go. And of course I went and I did not have a great time and I got COVID. So in retrospect, that was my intuition nudging me not to go. I'll give you another really cool example. A very close friend of mine was very randomly diagnosed with a brain tumor. And I say randomly on purpose. She was getting an MRI for something completely unrelated and they found a tumor. And it was an aggressively growing tumor. And they said that she had to have brain surgery to get this thing out and, get your affairs in order. This was during the pandemic lockdown. It was just a crazy, crazy time for her. So she had a scheduled surgery and she was going about her days, getting her life wrapped up. And something happened where she found a new surgeon that somebody knew. So she transferred hospitals. But all things were still a go. She had her surgery scheduled at this new hospital and she was going to go in. And she went in the day before for her pre-op and they did another MRI and just got her all set up for her surgery. Then the next morning, we were all on a group text as she went into the hospital for her surgery, and she was sitting in the waiting area, all hooked up to her little nodes and stuff. And she was waiting for them to come in and say, okay, we're going to roll you into the operating room now. And her surgeon came in and he's like, I just looked at your MRI results from yesterday, and whatever it is in your head, it's not growing. So it's not aggressive, and it's actually not behaving like cancer, or it's not behaving like a tumor. Those were his exact words. And she's like, what does that mean? He said, we don't know if you actually have a brain tumor or not, but I feel confident enough that we're not going to drill into your skull today. So off you go. Have a nice day. And off she went. And the interesting thing about the story is from the time that she was diagnosed right to the day of her surgery, I felt so strongly that something was awry. She did not have a brain tumor, that there was a mistake. And I knew it, and I told her that. And sure enough, she said to me afterwards, you called it. You were right. And I knew in my heart, in my gut, that she wasn't going to have an operation that day. And sure enough, it didn't happen. So how's them apples? I'm not a medical intuitive, by the way. However, that does remind me that there are 3 books I highly recommend if you want to dive into learning more about intuition. So the first one is Developing Intuition by Shakti Gawan. The second one is Intuition by Amisha Gadali. And the last one is Awakening Intuition by Dr. Mona Lisa. Dr. Mona Lisa, is a neuroscientist, a medical intuitive, and she also has ADHD. So she's got some really interesting perspectives and a podcast of her own. So I highly recommend that. But anyways, I do really think that we have a stronger sense of intuition because we pick up patterns, and we also have a much stronger developed right brain where intuition is based. So because of that, we can pick up things that neurotypicals don't necessarily pick up. And I think that that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in the sense that we can use our intuition to really steer our life in the right direction. And from everything I've heard, your intuition rarely steers you in the wrong direction, if ever. And it's also a curse in the sense that it makes it very difficult to be in certain environments where, you can't focus on anything. So loud restaurants, big crowds, concerts, things like that, I can't do them anymore because there's just so much going on and my brain doesn't know what to focus on. So I'm going to lean into intuition as my booby prize. No, it's not a booby prize. I would rather have intuition than go to a concert any day of the week. If there's one thing I would say that relates to the last 2 points I made, it's really developing a strong trust in your own decision making and realizing that you are the expert of you and that nobody on this planet, not even your mother, has your lived experience, has lived in your body, has had all the experiences that you have, and knows you as well as you know yourself. So you are the expert in you. And it's so critical that you find support that enables you to find your own way rather than other people solving for you, because that's never a helpful thing. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope you found that helpful. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. Take everything anybody says with a grain of salt, because you are here to live your own life on your own path, and you've got a strong intuition as a tool to guide you in the right direction, and you have a beautiful brain. So on that note, I wish you a wonderful week, and I will see you in the next video.